Für Massimo?
Ja. Okay. Ja.
Ja.
Klicken sozusagen.
Ja. Okay. So, good morning, everybody. Let me welcome you, and in particular, welcome Massimo Morelli, our today's speaker. This is the first political economy lecture after 10 years of having our collaborative research center on the political economy of reforms. One reason why we more or less start with this lecture is also a little bit to concentrate our activities. As you all know, we have so many series, so many talks, so we want to have some highlights. And when we started to think about this lecture, immediately one name came to our mind, because Massimo is more or less the perfect fit for this lecture. Massimo studied social sciences first, right, in Italy. Then, typically for a very prominent colleague, he made his PhD in economics, I have to underline, not in political science, at Harvard. Then he spent some years in the United States, having associate professorships at several other places. And more or less finally, he came back to his university, Bocconi University, where he's now not mainly employed in the Faculty of Economics, but in political science with affiliation in economics. But this is only more or less the formal side. Much more impressive is his publication record. I think, I believe, you are one of the very few people publishing in major journals of both disciplines. And I know how demanding this is. More or less, it's impossible. Yeah? Because in the major journals, you are required to know the literature of each discipline. And once you do not know what has been published in one discipline or sub-discipline, you are likely to be out, right? And Massimo achieved to publish both in American Political Science Review early on, later on more in American Journal of Political Science. He also became an associate editor of a political science journal of PSRM. And however, he also published in Econometrica, American Economic Review, just to name a few. Yeah? So it's really amazing, his record. And if you go a little bit closer, it's also amazing that he investigates a lot of different topics, covering topics like international conflict, but also legislative bargaining, political parties, electoral behavior, or respectively electoral systems. And I think today we have the pleasure to listen to his lecture, which a little bit, I think, comprises these different dimensions, right? So on the one hand, behavior, but also rules, and I guess also a theory, a formal theory, which helps us to understand what's going on in the world of populism. So thank you very much, Massimo, to have accepted our invitation, because you are a well-demanded person and traveling a lot. So I'm happy to have you here and to have introduced here for this lecture. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for this very kind introduction. This is the fourth or fifth or even sixth time in recent times that I'm coming to Mannheim. I always accept invitations here. I find the intellectual atmosphere of this campus particularly interesting for many reasons. And I also welcome this opportunity to say that the ties that we now start to have between Bocconi and Mannheim, with the beginning double degree with 2 positions, etc., hopefully will be something that will find other ways, and it would be very nice to strengthen that connection. So coming to the topic of this lecture, the title says Causes and Consequences of Populism for International Relations. So let me spend a couple of sentences on the title itself. As you will see in the quick description of a few papers that I will give you, most of the effort in this recent years has been on the causes part, causes of populism, and typically these causes are either related to global phenomena or related to domestic phenomena. So at least in terms of the causes, there is something to be said coming from the literature, both domestic and international relations relevant. For the consequences, instead, you have a pretty old literature on consequences of populism for past important examples of populism in history, Latin America, etc. But in any case, obviously, the study of the consequences of the current wave of populism is too early to do empirically. And moreover, there is very little work on the consequences for international relations. And so what I will do is I will shut down in my presentation all the theory components that relate to the stuff that you must have heard a few other times. So all the causes and consequences at the domestic level, I will only tell you the relevant things I need to tell you. But for the theory component, since Thomas mentioned that I always like to have at least a little bit of formal theory in my talks, I will limit my efforts towards the end of the talk to tell you what predictions I'm venturing to make about the consequences of populism for international relations specifically, because that's the part where we don't, you probably have heard less results to date. Very good. Okay, let me get familiar with the machine here. So this is the motivation slide, yes? So which one should I press? The one, the bottom, or no, this one? Okay.
Yeah, this is
okay.
motivation.
Okay, motivation, very good. So, as I said, as a motivation, what I want to cover in this lecture is the whole trajectory. It's a bit ambitious in that sense, but as you will see, I will not be going into details for many of the pieces. But I want to give the trajectory from what may have caused this populism wave. What are we really talking about? Is it mostly an economic or a cultural phenomenon? And is it more of a demand or a supply side phenomenon? How do the demand and supply of populist policies interact? What explains the entry of new players in the political sphere, and what explains the different behavior of the incumbents and outsiders, etc. So that's the political economy at the domestic level. I'll give you, and it's important because, as I will show you, it has some implications also for international relations. And then, of course, there is a broader debate that gets closer to international relations. One level is, is it really globalization that is at fault, and for what reason? Is it because of inequality or because of interaction with institutions? And then finally, like the last bullet point of this motivation slide, is perhaps the newest part of the talk, namely, let's see what I can predict that this could create in terms of consequences on inequality outside the countries that are sort of experiencing this populism wave. And there are some implications also for probability of civil war and probability of interstate war. All right, so this is the summary of paper 1, yes? So the first paper that is now under review together with Guizzo, Herrera, and Sonno, populism, demand and supply, tries to accomplish at the empirical level the first part of the agenda also of this talk. Namely, what we do in that paper, we look at the European Social Survey data set, and we try to provide an identikit of what are the characteristics of the voters who shift towards a populist party. And that's on the demand side, of course. And still on the demand side, we explore what is the role of turnout, because one of the methodological points we stress is that in order to properly assess the effects of economic insecurity and other individual characteristics on the decision to vote populist, you have to go through an intermediate step of the voting decision itself. Abstention is an intermediate step that is actually important both methodologically for the consistency of estimation and theoretically to understand what's going on. And finally, in order to say whether it's really to kind of strengthen the point that we want to make, that it is mostly an economic phenomenon, we'll see that the variables like trust and attitudes towards immigrants that are also equally important in the direct explanation of populist voting and abstention, they themselves are a function of changes in economic security perception, and that you can capture through a pseudo-panel analysis. And this is all on the demand side of the analysis of that paper. On the supply side, for consistency, we want to check that indeed the decisions to enter or to become populist by certain parties and candidates is a decision that can also be explained with similar timing by the same changes in economic security perception, because of course supply goes where demand is, and also the orientation of populism, of populist parties, left and right, must have something, if our perspective is correct, to do with where is the larger political space for entry. And finally, this journey of demand and supply ends with a short analysis in the paper of what happened after entry to the positioning and behavior of quote-unquote non-populist parties. Okay, so this first paper, of course I'm doing advertising so that you go and read it and send us comments. It makes you do this journey through the demand and supply, according to us, from 2002 to 2016. So this is the definition of populism, yes? So the definition of populism is pretty much recognized to always have to include at least as part of the definition the pro-people, anti-elite rhetoric, right? Now, whether this we the people against the elite rhetoric is a purely supply side component or not, this is a matter of identification, because of course it could well be that the perception by a strategic politician who is entering with the primary goal of winning, strategically adopting the anti-elite rhetoric could be a function of the fact that there is an anti-elite sentiment in the population. So even though the definition of the Encyclopedia Britannica seems to emphasize the supply side, like it's the politician's definition of what it means to be a populist on the politician side, still it doesn't tell us that it's primarily in a supply side per se. Okay, and moreover, the definition continues by saying that in fact the politicians pander to people's fears and enthusiasm. So this second part of the definition emphasizes, in fact, if you wish, the potentially office-seeking nature and strategic nature of the politician who is simply pandering to changes in demand. Okay, so the definition itself does not allow to disentangle demand and supply. It only allows us to say that in the data, consistently with what political scientists have been doing, from Van Kessel to Mudd and others, the most easily measurable characteristic that makes us call a politician or a party populist must have to do with the anti-elite rhetoric, regardless of whether it's induced by strategy or is instead the primary sources, like the chicken instead of the egg. No? Regardless of that, the observable differences are mostly in that, because you can use manifestos, platforms, speeches, text analysis. So it's much easier to characterize parties as populist versus non-populist based only on that first component. But of course, as we expected, there is a strong correlation between that characteristic, basically the first part of the definition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, and the second one, which you can try to evaluate looking at what policies are proposed in the platforms. And so, roughly speaking, those policies that are proposed in the platform, we call them short-term protection, because they include all things, including closing borders, closing markets, building wall, exiting the system, breaking out of the euro. All these things are basically policies that are aimed to pander to people's fears that they're not going to make it within this current system, and they propose simple fixes that are not really fixes but breaks. Okay, so if you look at the correlation in the paper, there's a pretty high correlation between these two components of the definition by the Encyclopedia Britannica. So I thought that for the sake of making you focus on the main variables of interest for the talk, this is the definition that we could keep in mind. All right. So this will be the slide on the sequential argument, yes? Okay, so here is the sequence of events and logical sequence that I'm pushing in this part of the talk. So I will not provide you formal theory of this, and in the paper we decided to keep it out. There is a formal theory attempt going on to formally obtain this sequential structure, but it's quite complicated. So let's leave it out. Let me just give you the logical, the way we think about it logically, okay? So think about it the following way. It's a crisis first, and the crisis of a special type, because it's a crisis of both markets and governments. It used to be the case for the crisis before the end of the 90s, before this period that we look at in the data, that crisis could be associated after World War II either to markets, in which case there was a political response to go left, to go towards government responses, or crisis of the governments, in which case the response was a right-wing reaction to go more towards free markets. But the specific nature of the types of crisis of the last 2 decades, in particular the Great Recession, etc., is that it affected in various ways both markets and governments. And one story why that is true is supplied, for example, by Roderick early on in 1999, when we were discussing the pros and cons of globalizing more the economy and making and what would be the consequences of the international, of the European Monetary Union, and so on and so forth. And he said, he was one of those who warned not only against the idea of having only the euro and no fiscal union, no other political union, etc., which is a topic of other discussions that we already had in the past. But also, the way he put it was roughly like this. Like, imagine that an economy that is fastly globalizing means, if it's true that markets generate inequality, it means that you are increasing the set of winners and the set of losers. So there are more losers from the winners and losers creation of markets that would need to be compensated, and because domestically, in fact, the growing debt for 40 years and the growing deficits and the growing size of the states, etc., make it difficult, as we know now with the discussions about austerity, etc. It makes it quite difficult domestically to compensate the increasing losers, then you are stuck in a bad situation, because from the perspective of the voters, you have both the global market to blame, because, hey, the threat is directly coming from outside, it's coming from Chinese products, it's coming from East, it's coming from immigrants, it's coming from, things that are, if we remain open in all senses, we have increasing fear, or even the robots, right? So increasing fear of losing our jobs, losing our possibilities of being fine with our income, et cetera, et cetera. And on top of that, the capacity of the current mainly domestic institution to respond to those crises and to respond to the increased number of losers is actually going down, okay? Because, of course, and this is the subject of another paper, of course, the domestic capacity to respond depends also on the critical role that monetary and fiscal policy have, and within the Eurozone that is limited, because you don't have the independence of playing with monetary policy, obviously by construction, and you also have a lot of constraints on the ability to use fiscal policy to counter shocks. So there is a little trust, there is a rational demand for something different. So when we think about, first thing to say about demand and supply of populism, my view is that if you focus on these structural changes as a starting point, you should have a view that the populism demand is actually legitimate. Contrary to the famous phrase of Hillary Clinton that described the populist voters or supporters of Trump as quote-unquote deplorable, which was a huge mistake in a political campaign, one could say, hey, these problems of our current society, economy, capitalism, etc., are real. It is a real problem that you have more and more challenges coming from outside, and the response ability of each individual domestic national policies is reduced. So you clearly have a situation in which many people could be upset, both by the fear of competition by immigrants, competitors, losing the job, relocation of firms, etc., and by observing that institutions and local traditional parties are not able to give much in response, and the welfare state is going down to drain. So that's kind of the starting point. And therefore, what you should observe in the data is that the first effects of the crisis, perhaps even before an actual vote for the populists, should be a reduction in trust in institutions, in domestic institutions and European institutions, because they are blamed for being incomplete and ineffective in terms of these welfare requests. And also reduction in trust in the incumbent political parties, because of course the crisis and the failures to respond to crisis, obviously the blame goes on the incumbent traditional parties. So the reduction in trust in both, and reduction in willingness to participate, because even just thinking about a simple expressive voting framework makes you think that, hey, if the benefits of participating to politics is perceived to be lower, then of course most traditional theories of expressive voting will tell you that people turn out less. And then you create this next step, which is you have a bunch of people who are disaffection with institutions, parties, and are not voting, etc. This opens up an entry political space for outsiders, for challengers, okay? Which could be new parties and candidates, or could be someone who was already, like the Lombard League in Italy, an active party, but completely changed design, completely changed strategy in the face of this transformation. So you have a political space. In political science, often when measuring entry or political space, we are talking about the left-right dimension. Is there more space to enter on the left or the right? Whereas here it seems that this has to be combined with this disaffection effects, with these trust effects. Is there more abstention going on the left or the right? That could, in principle, affect where and how the populists decide to enter. And when they enter, surprise, surprise, they will enter with types of policies that respond to the type of fear that people have developed. If people have developed a fear that the current liberal democratic system with markets invading us from every place, and the state, potentially compensating, but not doing it because of the constraints, then you have to break some of that paradox of liberal democracy. And then, not surprisingly, the demand is perceived to be something that breaks these constraints. How do you break these constraints? Well, exit, Brexit, walls, those are all symbolic, right? Because at the end, well, some of them are not just symbolic, they are also effective and big deals. But if you think about the wall in the United States, I'll get back to this later, it's mostly a symbolic thing. So there is this symbol that is a supply response. This short-term protection is to be expected. It's not a surprise that someone enters and with that specific type of policy. So again, this is the sequential argument I want to push. And so in order to show you that this seems to already have some evidence, even just from descriptive statistics, let me skip ahead a few slides. Is this the Italy picture? Italy, yes. So this shows you, just to give you a graphical representation of what I told you, that this sequential argument, even before doing the econometric analysis, seems to be consistent with the data. If one looks at Italy, you see first a decline of the green line, industrial production. Then you have a decline in the purple and red lines for trust and turnout. And only after that, you have a sharp increase of the supply side, of the blue line, okay? So the timing seems to be consistent with that argument I sketched. Similarly for Greece, pretty much the same story. And for France, of course, there could be a long debate, because the question is how do you treat the existing parties and when they start becoming populist and so on. And we don't have time to have that debate, but roughly speaking, France also is broadly consistent. Of course, not all countries would fit exactly this picture, but this is just a suggestive evidence for you that the sequential argument was based on a few case study anecdotal observations that motivated our structure. Okay, is this the data? Predictions on the demand side, yes, very good. So just to summarize, the predictions on the demand side that I want to emphasize are, one, that indeed economic insecurity is one of the drivers of why people first abstain and then decide to vote populist. Together with it, there will be other characteristics, including, of course, trust and attitudes towards immigration, and including education, information, political information, etc. And the second part, which is part of the building the story for the sequential argument, is that those potentially more cultural variables like trust and attitudes towards immigrants are themselves causally affected by economic insecurity changes. Therefore, the direct plus indirect effect of economic insecurity becomes extremely large when you take into account those two things together. Now, for the supply side, what we do in that paper is simply to double check that indeed the decision to enter follows pretty much the logic of follows the changes in the demand side. So if you wish, the supply side is there to confirm the key role of the demand side. Okay, so if the broad picture I want to convey is that, yes, of course, there are changes happening on the supply side, but the changes that are happening on the supply side are totally rationalizable based on what is happening on the demand side. So in a sense, if you want to have a punchline, the demand is driving everything, okay? And then we do other things, looking at orientation, looking at, testing the political space. And in a separate paper, this is the slide on the paper with Margherita Negri, yes? In the separate paper that, again, I don't have time to talk, but I can send you if you are interested once it's ready. We study this entry timing choice formally, And the reason why for this particular step, it is useful to have a formal theory is that one of the key questions that, for example, I keep discussing with Guido Tabellini in Bocconi, but with many other people, one of the key questions when thinking about the sequential argument I told you about is, but why couldn't the incumbents figure it out that these demand changes were happening? Why couldn't they preempt the entry of populists by providing at least some of the protection policies that the populist entrants decided to champion? And the answer is not easy, but it can actually be explained with the citizen candidate model, because the citizen candidate model is a way to capture the fact that, of course, people are, especially the incumbents, are already associated with some preferences. Parties are associated with a history of preferences and political positions, etc. And it's not easy to switch and abandon your legacy, abandon your history, you know, of the Democratic or Communist or Christian Democrat Party, and change things just because of the changes of demand, right? And so one way to capture it is to say that, hey, voters are associating candidates with more or less a credible position, especially the incumbents. So the citizen candidate model is the correct one to study it. And what we show in this paper, and this is just shameless advertising, is that indeed there exists an equilibrium where you have an entrant that takes a populist position on the closure of markets or borders or things like that on that dimension, and takes also an extremist position on the left-right dimension, together with the incumbents maintaining instead the traditional position. So we have it as an equilibrium. In fact, the description that I gave you, in that equilibrium, it is not rational for the traditional, it cannot happen that the traditional parties prevent entry by the populists, okay? So this is part of a specific response to that point, and I leave it on the side for now. So going back to the empirical documentation for the first part of the journey, the data we use, as I said, is the European Social Survey, and of course the question. The main question of interest is to look at the questions in the survey about whether people voted or not and whom they voted for. And then, of course, among the other 500, 600, 800 questions that were present in the survey, we selected a few that were related to our question. This is the slide on the responses we choose to look at, right? Yeah, so look at them. Obviously, you want to have some individual characteristics as controls, the first 2 bullet points. But then, of course, the key things are, you know, creating an economic insecurity index, putting together the various answers that related to economic conditions. How well are you doing with respect to your, you know, what's your perception that is your income sufficient, or does it put you in difficulty, and so on and so forth. Plus, of course, information about where these respondents were living and working, which sector, is it a geographic region or an industry that is affected by globalization changes or by immigration threats. And then, of course, attitudes. We recorded the answers about you know, attitudes towards immigrants, trust levels, et cetera, et cetera. And because this is not a panel, because the respondents to each year surveys in the 26, 27 countries are not always the same people, we constructed a pseudo panel by constructing five-year artificial cohorts in order to be able to trace the dynamics of these preferences, looking at as a sort of artificial individual, a five-year cohort. Okay, so that's the data we use. So turnout, I want to say one thing, in case you you are curious about, what's the main methodological contribution of, or one of the main contributions of the paper, and why is it worth reading from the point of view of applying that methodology in other studies. One thing that it's very important to note is that turnout affects both theoretically and empirically the way you estimate the effect of economic insecurity on populism, right? Because if you call P the percentage of people who vote populist, so the number of people who vote populist, V is the number of people who actually turn out to vote, and N is the total electorate, then if you do what Inglehart and Norris did in their empirical work to actually use as dependent variable P over N, so the percentage of people who vote populist out of the total set of people who are eligible to vote, right? Then you run the risk that you could find a false zero. You could say, oh, the economic insecurity measures we have don't really impact on the probability, on the percentage of people who vote populist, measured as P over N. And this should not be a surprise, because P over N is equal to P over V times V over N, right? So it's those who vote populist out of those who vote times those who vote out of those who could vote. And those variables that we discussed before, trust, attitudes, and of course economic insecurity, push in different directions. They can make you go down, they can make V over N go down, right? Because you are disaffectionate, you don't vote. On the other hand, conditional on voting, you are more likely to vote populist, so P over V goes up. So surprise, surprise, P over V goes up, V over N goes down, so it could happen that if you use as dependent variable P over N, you find a zero, but that's a totally false result, okay? The result is that both P over V and V over N are significantly affected by economic insecurity changes. And therefore, the correct way to study this phenomenon is to do a simultaneous estimation of these two things using the Heckman correction methodology. Okay, so this is just as a reminder of why maybe you want to look at that. In terms of the results, by doing this Heckman correction properly, we hope, we do find indeed that economic insecurity changes have a significant direct effect, being exposed to globalization, having changes in your employment or in your income or your household's income, et cetera, and moreover, and this is perhaps the part that especially my co-author Luigi Guiso, who is a big expert in culture study, was quite interested, was to see the indirect effect, right? So exploiting the pseudo panel, we were able to see that the trust and responses in terms of attitudes towards immigrants were in fact significantly affected by changes in economic insecurity. So of course, like the sum of direct and indirect effects is in the paper we mention big percentages and so on. I don't know if I would trust the exact numbers, but certainly they're both very significant effects. So I will skip the further discussion about entry because I think I've mentioned a lot. I will now skip the pictures that I've shown you before, and this is the slide on the summing up. Yes. So what I want you to therefore remember of this first part of the lecture is this sum up slide, namely, okay, I've in that first paper we do provide some concrete evidence of that sequential argument I mentioned, and in terms of the debate between economic insecurity and culture as a cause of the populism on the demand side, our preferred way to put it is to say that there is a cultural channel more than a cultural independent cause, okay? The cause is economic, but of course the changes in economic insecurity do affect things that usually go in the count on the, as cultural variables. And so that there is a cultural channel, but not a cultural independent change. So that's the demand side. And by the way, Again, shameless advertising. I'm writing a separate paper with Gloria Gennaro and Gianpaolo Lecce, which is going to be presented very soon, like in a MPSA and other conferences, but we don't have a draft yet, but it's very, very soon ready, where we study very similar thing about the US. So what we did is we collected all the speeches, not all, but all the available speeches in all the, wherever we could, of Clinton and Trump in 2016 for the primaries and in the general elections. And based on those texts, we constructed a continuous measure of populism. There are interesting results showing, for example, how Trump's strategy was extremely sensitive to the different localities where the rallies were, when the district where the rally was occurring was particularly affected by an economic condition, and where in fact the race was supposed to be close, there was an incredibly high jump in the amount of populist rhetoric. So very sensitive. So his rhetoric, although it, of course, is known to have a very simple language, etc., but it changed dramatically, systematically, and very sharply from district to district. Whereas basically the speech of Hillary Clinton was flat, had no response to the local conditions. And then what we do is we basically train the algorithm based on the 2016 elections, and we bring that to the 2018 midterm elections. And we basically find that basically looking at all the outsiders challenging positions in the House, those running in districts with higher economic insecurity characteristics and close races, they're using the same populism index constructed in the 2016 election for Trump versus Clinton. We find that indeed they strategically use the populism rhetoric much more, and it actually pays off big time. So there is evidence, basically using the U.S. As a case study, that even though the populism phenomenon is a demand-driven phenomenon based on economic insecurity, the politicians are rationally taking that into account. Mostly on the Republican side for various reasons, but also some Democratic outsiders were doing that, and it actually pays off still. So we are still in a phase in 2018 elections in which at least some populist rhetoric is still paying off. Okay. So now demand and supply interact. So preferences on the demand side and strategy on the supply side, of course, interact with institutions as well. So in this other paper with Guizio, Herrera, and Sonno that is forthcoming on economic policy, what we show is that for the case of Europe, the famous globalization, China shocks, and financial crisis shocks, etc., explain populism only through the interaction with Eurozone dummy. So only within the Eurozone it is true that globalization affects and financial crisis affected significantly the change of decisions to vote towards populists. And the reason we offer in that paper is to say, well, those are the countries where there is a perception of a policy straitjacket, where there is a perception that, hey, monetary policy is chosen elsewhere, and fiscal policy is basically, we are very much constrained in what we can do in terms of fiscal policy. So the policy straitjacket effect is there. And moreover, it's pretty easy for multinational and national companies to move from the Eurozone to outside the Eurozone, where those constraints don't exist and where they can absorb some of the globalization shock. Okay? And so that's kind of, it's a point that I make for two reasons. That first of all, globalization per se is not necessarily, it's not sufficient to explain what's going on. Even though initially I said, yeah, that's part of the Rodrik story in general, but Rodrik was also active saying that we shouldn't have done the euro alone without political union. So it's consistent what I'm telling you. I think Rodrik would agree with this combination of the 2 points, right? That is not per se a problem. If you have a global set of policies that can respond to globalization, then there is no problem. The problem is that we are going more and more domestic in the responses when the economy is going more and more global, right? And so that's the problem that I have with other papers. So there's this paper by Pastor and Veronesi on globalization and inequality, both model and empirics for the US, where they show that they first show theoretically that the way globalization works for asset pricing and in finance in general, it clearly generates more inequality. No matter what, there is a monotonic increase in inequality when you globalize asset market more and more, and therefore, like their logic is if you put even just a little bit of inequality aversion in people's utility function, eventually, given the monotonic effect of inequality, it has to be expected that we'll go towards at least one aspect of populism, which is protectionism. Okay, but the point is that the cute model. But in reality, I don't believe that it's inequality aversion. I don't believe that too many people have a significant component of inequality aversion in the utility function. And in any case, it seems to be going through a broader effect on economic insecurity. Maybe part of it is inequality, because if you are not doing that well and you're seeing inequality increasing, you see the jump you have to make to climb up the ladder of society to be larger. But it's a broader picture. It's not just inequality per se. And moreover, like the big problem of this globalization and inequality nexus is that on the one hand, people are using the effects of globalization on inequality as potentially an excuse to actually close markets or to increase demands for protectionism. But this is a paradox, because the moment what is happening is very global. So you have robotization is a global phenomenon. Automation is a technological phenomenon. Technology more than global, right? So its fundamentals are changing that are making actually capital a much more important factor of production than labor over time. The set of workers, dependent labor in particular, are going down. So if you focus exclusively on nationalism response to globalization crisis, what you're going to get is a shrinking set base for your tax revenue, because you're only going to be able to do basically taxes on labor income, which is shrinking. Whereas, of course, capital taxation is zero. Multinational companies are paying zero taxes. So the real culprits of inequality are elsewhere, and you don't tackle them. And nobody's actually talking about how to make feasible the taxation of the real rich, which are not the domestic rich, but the global rich. No? So nobody's talking about that. Roosevelt didn't have to do that. When the New Deal was proposed and implemented, there was no need to worry too much about domestic versus global, because imposing 75% marginal tax rate on the rich in the US at the time in which capital flight and movement towards tax havens was almost non-existent or very small, was basically the solution for fixing the inequality problems at that time. Now there is no Roosevelt, but there is also no technological possibility to make the New Deal effective if you limit yourself to domestic policies. Okay, so that's why globalization and inequality is a problem, is a problematic connection. And that's where I want to push now the rest of the talk. I want to say, so this is the transition from causes to consequences, yes? So this transition from causes to consequences slide is meant to strengthen what I just said, namely that even if we believe for a second that the way to stop the inequality hike due to globalization is to close markets, close borders, etc., something that obviously I disagree with. Even if you believe that, then by implementing the protectionism policies that are associated to that way to respond, will actually generate more inequality globally. So the inequality that you could perhaps cure within the US by by protectionism policies in the US is going to be a major source of export of inequality in developing countries. And so, even if one believed that closing markets and borders could have some locally short-term protection effect for the voters of the country that is accepting a leader pushing for those policies, globally you should be worried about the fact that this will have exactly on the same assumed culprit of that transition. Okay, so there are multiple disconnects and paradoxes here. And so the way to elucidate this is with a model. So this should be the model that I have with Mattozzi and Nakaguma, correct? So now I'll slow down because now I'm gonna be precise on the description of the model, and at the end you will see the connection between proposing you this framework for the consequences for international relations formally and the big picture about causes of populism in general. Okay, so take this model. So imagine a country divided ethnically, and there is an ethnic group that controls the government, G, and an ethnic group that is in the opposition, and for simplicity we call it R, even though of course not all ethnic groups have a corresponding rebel groups, but that's for the empirical thing. Now we don't talk about empirics, we're talking about theory. So it's G and R, and we borrow for the description of their potential interaction in terms of peace war decisions, the framework of Baliga and Sjöström various articles on theories of war. But on top of that, we put a simple addition, which is this X, this little X in the bottom right cell of the matrix, where that X is subject to bargaining. So we want to allow, in a model where we want to, at the end of the day, talk about how probability of war changes when something externally changes, like protectionism by superpowers. We want to also allow bargaining because, after all, if I want to talk about inequality, I need to at least allow the government to react to a shock by changing the distribution of the surplus endogenously. So in some cases, the bargaining will be such that you have a peaceful readjustment of the distribution of the surplus when a shock occurs, in which case only inequality is affected up or down. In other cases, the bargaining fails, and in that case, you have war. So you have to trace them together. Okay, so that's the attempt. So to explain in detail, suppose that both the government and the rebel group have a simple binary choice between a hawkish strategy, H, and a dovish strategy, D. So hawk and dove could be attack and not attack, could be militarized or not militarized. So in terms of the empirical implementation of the idea for later discussions, as usual in international relations, you can apply it to various levels of militarized interstate disputes and so on. But right now, let's take this hawk and dove as pretty general. Okay, so in case they both choose hawk, then there is it means that they're both militarized. They're both intending to do this war. The war is gonna perhaps last very long. There's gonna be high duration. So to capture that there could be higher duration when both rebels and governments want to go for the fight to the finish, we introduce this parameter psi that is basically a scaled down factor of the total divisible surplus W, right? So if it's a longer and more intentional conflict, then potentially this psi W could be smaller than W, of course. And lambda captures the probability of winning for the rebel, and theta captures potential first strike additional advantage that can increase the probability of winning of the group that moves first. or it could be geographic advantage. And then W, of course, captures the divisible surplus, which could be divided in domestic surplus and gains from trade. And then there are costs. And notice that the costs, CR and CG, are potentially different from DR and DG, which are the destruction costs in case a country or a group is the one surprised by the attack. Okay, this is consistent with the evidence that the cost of war for those who are attacked are typically higher than those for those who actually attack. But this is not very important, just for consistency with other things that we might want to check in the comparative statics and potentially later on in the empirics. And finally, the bottom right cell, it tells you, these are always the payoffs for the rebel only. You can fill in the matrix with the payoffs for the government if you want, but it's efficient to look at the payoffs for the rebels. So the bottom right cell, when they're both dovish, there is peace, and so in peace, the total surplus W is peacefully shared, and the rebels get a share X. The government maintains a control on the share 1 minus X. Okay? So therefore, you can think of this game as basically, on the one hand, it's a simple application of Baliga-Sjöström, so not surprisingly, war happens whenever at least one of the two decides to be hawkish, whereas, of course, for peace, you need both to decide to be dovish, and that's typical of these, if you wish, coordination games. But on top of that, the little novelty just to trace inequality and probability and war together that we introduce is the fact that there will be an endogenization of some sort of this X. So that once a shock occurs, we can first see what the government revision, think about also in the international relations, the language of revision, the revisionist, etc. No? So there is a shock, there is a demand for a revision, the government decides whether to revise X. Then after the revision has been made, there is still the decision to attack or not, depending on how big the revision has been. Okay? So that's the model. This is the assumption slide, yes? So what are the assumptions? This is pretty much standard in order to obtain some equilibrium war, is to put some asymmetric information. So the government knows its own costs, but doesn't know at the time of the surplus division revision what is the cost of war for the rebels. So there is a uncertainty at the time of the revision X about CR. CR is from a uniform distribution from 0 to CR per bar. And the second part of the assumption is that the CR per bar is greater than W just in order to focus on interior solutions. If you allow it to be smaller than W, then you have to analyze corner solutions, and it's boring, but you can do it. And the final assumption is methodological, if you want. So in order to study together these things, the simplest way to do it is to assume that you have the revision on X under asymmetric information about the cost of war for the rebels, but then the decision to attack or not attack happens after the cost of war for the rebels. It becomes common knowledge. This is in order to avoid refinements and other things. But you can change the timing and need to change the solution concept. So to repeat, the timeline of the game. So first, you have to think that some shock happens. And now, for the sake of the discussion about causes and consequences of populism, the types of shock that I'm thinking about when zooming on the inequality and probability of war in a country like, I don't know, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and whatever, the type of exogenous shock that I want you at some point to reflect on are the consequences of having populism in the superpowers. Because the superpowers, and so not the US, but to some extent there is a discussion about the populism wave having and perhaps even before, affected other superpowers. Although within democracies, of course, it's mostly the US. So with a more populist environment, the two big changes in a reduced form for Yemen or Syria or whatever are, one, protectionism. So there's going to be less gains from trade for exporters if the trade war starts and consolidates. And two, strategic disengagement, because America first, Italy first, whatever, is going to mean that there is, in fact, it is happening, a big reshuffling of the strategic geopolitical interests. And in some countries, there was a support for a government, and there is no longer. In some other countries, there was a support of a rebel group, and there is no longer, and so on. So you have a change of, of the external influence of the superpowers in the domestic games that I'm describing. And therefore, they affect what? They affect W and lambda, right? Because lambda is the probability of winning for the rebels. Of course, lambda is affected by a strategic disengagement of a superpower. And W has as a component gains from trade. You know, most countries where an ethnic division is relevant are countries that are typically you know, have an economy with a large share of exports of oil and gas and primary resources, natural resources, coffee, whatever. Okay, so clearly restrictions of the protectionist type and strategic disengagements could be exogenous shocks from the point of view of consequences, because we have already discussed the causes, right? So I've already tried to give you a sense in Europe and in the US about what are the causes. And then the reduced form is, oh, now if I go far away, in the Middle East or whatever, and they are only tangentially touched by the domestic causes of populism, but they suffer from these two reduced form effects that are happening outside. Okay, now I'm zooming in on what happens in that type of environment. So this should be the slide on the probability of war, yes? So not surprisingly, given that I ask you to focus on the timing, where first you decide on X, then there is the realization of state of nature, and then there is the final stage is the coordination game on war and peace. Let we start by the last part. So if you take X as given now, because you are zooming on the last part of the game by a sort of you know, vaguely speaking backward induction, but it's not, but similar idea. You go to the end of the game and you start from there, right? So for any given X, what is war caused by? Well, it's caused by the comparison that the rebels make between the payoff of peace, which is XW, and the payoff of surprising the government with an attack, which is lambda plus theta times W minus CR. So therefore, if you take X as given, for which realizations of CR would you have a war? Well, if CR is sufficiently large, not surprisingly, you are going to stay peaceful. So if CR is greater than lambda plus theta minus X times W, then of course you decide to stay peaceful. If the realization of costs is below that threshold, then you prefer the lottery of attacking. And so therefore, the probability of war with the uniform distribution is very simple to calculate, is the you know, lambda plus theta minus X W divided by CR per bar. Okay, so you have a function for the probability of war, which is, of course, you could also calculate with more, you know, elaborate probability distributions, but this is the easiest. And then you go back in the game, and you go to ask yourself for the completion of the equilibrium analysis, how is X chosen at the time in which the government is proposing a revision of the distribution of surplus. So what you do is you plug in the probability of war just computed into the formulation of the expected utility maximization program for the government that has to maximize with respect to X its expected utility, which is what? The probability of war, which at that point is a probability because the realization of cost has not happened yet, times the payoff of war, which for the point of view of the government is 1 minus lambda times psi w minus cg, plus you have the probability of peace times 1 minus x times w. So that's that's all. You write down that maximization program, you maximize it with respect to x, and you obtain an equilibrium x star. And then you plug back x star within the probability of war function calculated in the previous slide, and therefore, as a sort of indirect utility conclusion of the equilibrium analysis, you get the equilibrium probability of war for any values of the parameters. So give me any description of a country divided in 2 major groups that, and therefore, like, you know, if you start thinking, zooming on what one would do later on if one wanted to construct a sort of, you know, structural estimation, whatever, you go check for the various, for the countries that you want to analyze, what is the you know, correct proxy for W, lambda, psi, theta, and so on, and so on. And for all that, for each of those you know, compositions, or for each of those vectors of parameters, the simple model gives you x star and a probability of war star. Okay. Notice that x star is what I will call inequality, because when x is high, inequality is low, because typically, since in the bargaining game, the government is the one that makes the take it or leave it offer. Of course, you know, formally we make an assumption about it, but it's intuitive that you can think that all the equilibrium x star will be below 1/2. So roughly speaking, an increase in x star means more equality. A reduction in x star means more inequality. Okay, and and of course, probability of war is probability of war. Okay, so if you look at those 2 equilibrium conditions, you can start before I give you the formal results on the comparative statics. You can start kind of eyeballing and check. Well, what happens if, for example, lambda goes down because of strategic disengagement, right? The US or Russia are not protecting anymore the Kurds or something. Well, if lambda goes down, there is an opposite effect. So if lambda goes down, it means that the rebels are weaker, and in equilibrium, given that there is always a positive probability of war, this means that this weaker group is going to be in equilibrium treated worse, so there's going to be more inequality and less probability of war. So it's more oppression, more peaceful oppression. Whereas when lambda goes up, because, for example, instead the populist disengagement, America First, means lower support for a government that used to be supported in the previous geopolitical design, means lambda is going up, in which case the results are opposites. You have an increase in equality, but also an increase in probability of war. So in terms of the strategic disengagement, if you view war and inequality, if you view war and inequality as kind of both quote unquote bads for a second, then in a sense, no matter which effect the strategic disengagement have, up or down on lambda, at least one of the 2 is affected negatively, and the other one is affected positively. So it seems like the strategic disengagement has always effects, but then whether you think that the populism-based strategic disengagement overall has a positive or negative effect on you know, global welfare, it depends on how much you know, how big the weights you put on war and inequality as the social bets. Okay, so then therefore I'm not going to go in that direction But we can do some perhaps some discussion that is getting closer to a welfare, to a global welfare implications of the model when looking at wealth. So this is the wealth effect slide, yes? So if you just do the comparative statistics of X star and probability of war with respect to W, so a jump up in W is, for example, a discovery in natural resources, if you want, right? And I have a bunch of papers on that, and consistently with those papers, what happens when you have a discovery of natural resources? Well, you know, of course, there is a direct effect that given that the pie is larger, it's for the government is more worth taking on board the opposition. So X perhaps is also going up a little bit. But on the other hand, as the second part of the slide says, depending on the parameters, depending on psi, depending on how destructive the war is, depending on how destructive the lotteries are, there could be more incentives by the rebel to actually start a war because of the target value, you know, the value of the greed factor, as they call it in political science, is also going up when W goes up, right? And so you can actually think of this as the exact opposite of what would happen with the protectionism effect of Trump, right? If you go, this is the civil war through populism and civil war through trade, yes? Because what you can think of is that the effects of protectionism on those developing countries is like a reduction in W. And so if it is like a reduction in W, that means if you apply the results that I just described before in the comparative statistics, if you are thinking about that direct consequence of populism as a reduction in W, then what do you have? You have an unambiguous increase in inequality. That's the first part, right? Because the result is X star, partial X star, partial W is positive. Therefore, if W goes down, not surprisingly, you have an increase in inequality. So already we have an interesting, I think, at least from my perspective, point to make, that even if Pastor and Veronesi and others are right, that perhaps one of the key channels through which globalization impacted the political shift towards protectionism to obtain less inequality, etc., even if you buy that part, which I don't, still it's paradoxical because perhaps you could say that inequality is going to be reduced in the asset markets in the US, but the result suggests that you should be worried that by closing borders and markets, not only you have an obvious and we don't even need to model it, you have an obvious increase in cross-country inequality. That is obvious because you know, migration and trade, etc., are ways to arbitrage across markets, if you wish, and they reduce inequality across countries. So clearly there is not even need to model the fact that inequality across countries is going to increase. And on top of that, I show you that there are significant, in my view, reasons to believe that there is going to be an increase in within problematic countries inequality. So there is a clear phenomenon of export or spillover, externality more than export. So it's an externality of the anti-inequality, if that is what it is. Reaction in the US is an increase in inequality everywhere. Okay? The second part about effects on the war, since they depend on destructive parameters, and you know, the intuition is a bit less clear. So let's leave it for discussion, perhaps. But a few more words. This should be the slide on the effect of strength effects. Yes. So the strength effects are, as I said before. So now I'm just spelling them out in a slide, but I mentioned them before. So when lambda increases, because you are not supporting, you're not protecting a previous ally government anymore, then you have, on average, an increase in equality, but an increase in the risk of war. Whereas when lambda decreases, you can think of that as the situation, perhaps that is, you know, a stylized description of what's happening for the Kurds with the U.S. leaving Syria. You know, in that case, you have, you know, for sure a worse treatment of the Kurds in terms of the X share, and but perhaps that this model is a bit, in a sense, is even too optimistic because it's only looking at the greed factor. So from the greed factor point of view, the probability of war related to the Kurds, given the weakening, could actually go down. For example, or if you wish, the probability that they ask for, again, for independence from Baghdad in Iraq, given the lower international support, it could even go down. But on the other hand, of course, the optimism ends there because there is also grievances that cannot be captured by this thing. So it's not even clear that a situation where they're given a smaller X, when you factor in also grievances, is going to have that positive effects on the reduction of the probability of war. All right, so this is all I wanted to say. I just want to say a few more things about in the conclusions, and then I'll open to questions. So in terms of conclusions of the whole journey, just to repeat myself a little bit, I want to emphasize that I view the development, the causes of populism as totally rationalizable given the characteristics of liberal democracies in general. So, you know, liberal democracies as basically constructed and endorsed at the time of, you know, Bretton Woods and, you know, after World War II, pretty much have the stylized description of, okay, let's enjoy the benefits of the markets and trade. Let's abandon autarky that killed us between the two world wars, etc. And let's have basically the states do the welfare compensations. And after all, if you think about it, it was in 1951 that Ken Arrow wrote, you know, the first and second fundamental theorem of welfare economics, right? Let the market go if you can, especially when all the good assumptions of the first fundamental welfare work, and then you know, the second fundamental theorem is equally important for the liberal democracy conceptually because it tells you, and in some ways you're going to compensate the losers. But again, in a world where we have been doing it for 40 and 50 years, it's totally wrong to think that democracy is the end of history. Clearly it is not, because this system seems to run against the wall. You cannot domestically, with only domestic compensation policies, compensate for more and more winners or losers that are creating in the market. So there is a legitimate demand for change, and therefore populism has to be viewed as a phenomenon that on the demand side, rather than insulting people for being uneducated or uninformed or deplorable, that is a legitimate thing that is taking forms that of course differs from country to country, depending on education, depending on political behavior, culture, but the causes are there. And what is happening, paradoxically, is that on the policy supply side, because of the strategic incentives to get office, the closure policies are the most popular, the borders policies are the most popular, so we are closing more and more, so we are trying to respond more and more in various countries to global crises with national policies. It's a paradox, it's not gonna work. And therefore, in my, besides the specific consequences that I've laid out in the second part of this journey, so there are important consequences for inequality and war, etc., that we should be worried about, but there is also a policy debate that we should start, which is not a policy debate about what Germany should do or about what Italy should do, but it's about what should we advocate that WTO should do. Because it's pointless to fight in Italy about whether 7 billion euros are better used with the citizenship income, or with some other form of extremely weak redistribution. None of those uses of those 7 billions or whatever is going to change the political landscape. So we can discuss in Brussels whether to allow or not, or to criticize or not a certain use of the budget by the Italian government, sure, but in a sense it's peanuts. It's peanuts. We can say plus peanuts or minus peanuts, but it's always peanuts. Our goal as political economists should be to emphasize that and say, hey, this is a global problem. Those who are creating inequality are not even paying taxes. You know, we know Amazon just had 11.2 billion profits and paid 0 taxes on those, okay? So those are the real problems. And labor and taxes on labor in the individual countries, redistributed in whatever way you want, they're not gonna touch that. So there is a need for an international policies manifesto where at the end of the day we say both for mitigating the causes of populism and for mitigating the consequences of populism, which in this talk I tried to convince you could be devastating. We need changes in supranational policies. An example being, and this is the one thing that I'm trying to write down as a mechanism design problem, imposing a condition, another issue linkage with WTO. There are already issue linkages with WTO. There are conditions. There are human rights satisfaction conditions to enter WTO. Yes, there are issues that need to be satisfied in order to grant admission to WTO. So why not add as a condition for a country to enjoy the benefits of globalization that they actually tax the capital and they actually avoid the tax competition incentives, right? So right now, of course, it's easy to free ride. It's easy to say, hey, I cannot have this type of tax because of tax competition, because otherwise Gerard Depardieu goes to Belgium. But that is solved if you have a precondition at the WTO at the global level. So the fight is global. Forget about the peanuts in Italy or in Greece. That's not, let them discuss to the peanuts guys. We have to deal with the important stuff. I'm done. It's time for questions.
Yes. Thank you very much, Massimo, for this excellent lecture. I really liked it very much, but I'd like to open first the floor to questions from the audience. So,
Professor Morelli, my name is Massimo. In your presentation, you talk about populism in a general way with no reference to ideological position or nature of the populism. So I was wondering, are left-wing populism and right-wing populism considered the same for you? And are their calls, for example, the same? Are incentives of left and right-wing populism to enter in the party or electoral system the same? For example, I was wondering about the anti-elite rhetoric. Is like present equally in the left wing or right wing? And lastly, what are the consequences, if any, to your predictions, and also in terms of policy consequence when we distinguish populism based on the ideological?
Very good question. Okay, so first of all, the main answer to your question is that the key demand drivers of populism are the same, and they do not, we didn't need to distinguish left and right. They are the same in the sense that you have economic insecurity shocks affecting voters originally on the left or on the right. There is the same because the type of trust in institution and attitudes towards immigrants affected by fear, etc., affect people with different ideologies the same way. Now, of course, there is a level at which the ideology matters. And, well, first of all, it matters because in the decision about political space, obviously it does matter if the geographic location that you are trying to decide whether to enter or not as an outsider, politician, etc., is a place with a traditionally left or traditionally right ideology in the population, because people, as we know in various studies in political science, don't really change ideology easily, right? So the main effects, for example, in the US, in terms of going from one election to the other, are not in terms of, hey, I voted Democrat, now I vote Republican, and then I switch to Democrat. Or, no, it's mostly through mobilization. Sometimes those who are ideologically driven Democrats vote, sometimes they don't, depending on the disaffection, etc. So it's mostly about mobilization, and that's why even in terms of empirical relevance, we thought that, well, of course, if we are talking about a district that is mostly left, where the right-wing voters are very few, of course, the temptation to enter would be mostly for a left-wing type of populist, once those left voters that are ideologically more on the left have been so much affected by the crisis that they lost all their trust and so on. So once the hole is large enough, they jump in. But on the left, it wouldn't make too much sense to enter if you are an office-seeking strategic populist with a right-wing agenda in a place where ideologically the preferences are not aligned. So clearly, at the level of where to enter, etc., abstention plus all the other things that I mentioned do interact with the initial conditions in terms of left-right preferences. But that's pretty much it. And in terms of policies, there is an interesting thing to say that the Italian government right now offers some interesting example, right? So once, even though the Five-Star Movement and Salvini adopted on many dimensions a very similar political strategy, and in fact, same goes for Mélenchon and Marine Le Pen in the French elections. If you go check the manifestos and if you do text analysis on what they were pushing for, and also on the speeches, etc., it's incredible how the similarity index goes up quite quickly close to the election. So they were using very similar populist strategy, anti-elite, etc., etc. But at the end of the day, once they are in office, like in the case of Italy, you have both of them in office, what happens is that, of course, the left-wing guys push for populist policies that are actually expensive, because obviously citizenship income is expensive. Whereas the right-wing guy can push for identity things, for closing borders, which are really cheap. So not surprisingly, given that Italy has a budget constraint that is severely, severe, not surprisingly, Salvini is thriving and Five-Star Movement are losing, because from the point of view of the hopes of the voters of the Five-Star Movement, the peanuts that I mentioned before are peanuts, are perceived as peanuts. And it's not like the government could offer much more than peanuts, because we don't have more than peanuts in the budget, right? Whereas for Salvini's policies, peanuts are enough. And to actually have posturing on closing harbors, how expensive can it be? No? So in the short run, the reason why we see more populists on the nationalist right-wing side emerging in various countries is that it's completely rationalizable. It's not necessarily the case that the voters are becoming more right-wing nationalists, but it's the interaction between demand and supply. The supply of those policies is cheap, and it's more credible. They don't lose credibility right away. They don't lose credibility with voters right away. So over time, even for a medium run, they're going to stay up in votes. Okay, the problem is going to come from demography. I'm doing an analysis on a demographic study with some colleagues, also with the Trust Lab, etc. And it's pretty clear that eventually the policies, even the policies of nationalists, are going to bump into a wall. Why? One reason is the one I mentioned before, that of course if you focus on national, domestic, etc., you still are dealing with peanuts, and eventually those peanuts are not enough. But that's only the economic part. There is also another issue, which is voting, right? So if you, what is the European criticism of Salvini's policies these days? Quota 100, this policy to do early retirement. So this early retirement is crazy, because you have demographically more and more people, aging, more and more people, old people who have to be, paid their pensions by the system, so the demographic effect is significant. Moreover, you're closing borders more and more, so you're not getting immigrants to replace the birth of young generations to pay for the pensions. And moreover, you're also doing early retirement. So what we are showing is that, for example, already now in 20 out of 35 OECD countries that we study, the percentage of dependent workers out of the total eligible to vote is below 50%. Okay, and it is predicted that by 2035, 33 out of 35 OECD countries will have dependent workers over total electorate below 50%, which means that regardless of whether you have majority rule or proportional representation, but in different ways in those two systems, and we are studying those consequences as well, you're going to have that politically the pivotal player, the pivotal voter is going to be the pensioner, the unemployed and the pensioner, because intuitively, you know, you have the dependent workers who are those who don't like, within the domestic realm of policies, they don't like openness, because openness brings competitors. On the other hand, you have the employers who actually like openness and cheap wages, etc. So in the middle, so, you know, when we were talking about, in political economy, about taxation, redistribution, redistributive politics, the median guy is always a worker. But when it comes to those policies that relate to populism, immigration closures, globalization closures, etc., it turns out that the pivotal player is going to be an unemployed or pensioner individual. Okay, and so basically, what this type of policies with early retirement, etc., are going to make the fear of the pensioners not to have their pension paid eventually in Italy slowly higher and higher. So the same people that are targeting now between 58 and 65 that are happy to go to retire early, in 7 years they will revolt against that policy. So even the right will have to stop being national. So maybe the populists are going to stay there much longer than in the previous history of populism in previous time and space. But the nationalist component will have to go, because they're not stupid, and strategically they'll figure it out. So therefore, we need to beat the competition by going towards international policies before they know it.
I'm happy to be the pivotal voter soon,
Okay.
among those. Ulrich, yes?
Yeah, thanks, Massimo, for a very inspiring presentation. My name is Ulrich Wagner, I'm in the economics department. I want to go back to the causes and consequences slide where you were showing us the timing of entry with those European Social Survey values on the loss of confidence. You don't have to go
Okay.
Mentally. The question is this. If you had this picture with the data for other crises that we've seen, we've seen a number of economic crises since World War II. What is different this time around? Is it the speed of change or the speed at which parties can adjust? Why was a new labor in the 90s and not something more radical?
The difference is fiscal space.
Okay.
It's fiscal space. So what we show in one of the things we show in the economic policy forthcoming article is that if you do the exercise about a number of different crises, you see that there was in the last 20 years, you see that there is a perception of very, very tight fiscal space. Whereas, you know, the crisis in the 70s in Europe, in the 70s, in 60s and 70s, you know, Italy was growing well, and then comes the OPEC crisis, comes the, you know, inflation here, whatever. Yeah, we spend a little bit more. The fiscal space was huge. I mean, imagine now if Italy, instead of having 135% debt over GDP ratio, had still 60%. You know? Then you wouldn't worry too much about imposing a 2.04% deficit constraint, right? So it's to me the difference is that the liberal democracies, as we constructed it in after World War II, should not be thought as you know, like the pendulum of whatever, of Galileo Galilei, you know, that you let it go and keeps going. There is friction. There is attrition. The attrition is to the fiscal space. The fiscal space is shrinking. So now either we go to multinational, we go supranational in terms of policies as well, or if we fight about peanuts, well, go ahead. I'm not going to participate.
On your theoretical argument, you actually relied on the decrease in the turnout. However, in this project with Margarita, you rely on the citizen candidate models. And in this kind of models, voters do not have an option staying home and abstaining. So, will you reduce it there?
No. So because these are two, if you wish, the fact that one of the first political behavior reactions of voters when they lose trust and they see negative results, etc., is the stop to participation is a behavioral phenomenon, right? Or if you wish, you can explain it with expressive voting, or you can explain it with those type of things, which I still view as behavioral within the chapter of behavioral. It's a behavioral phenomenon. Whereas the reason why in the paper with Margherita we use citizen candidate model is because we wanted to fully rationalize why a potentially completely rational non-populist incumbent couldn't possibly prevent the entry of another rational politician that is attempting to enter, okay? So the turnout thing talks about a behavioral issue on the voting side, whereas the citizen candidate model tackles the rationalizability of an equilibrium where the entrant is going populist and the incumbents are not preventing the policy choice.
I have myself two questions, which I should never do, but in this case I do questions. And it goes back to your sequential argument, which I very much agree with. So if I understood it correctly, you say like economic shock, loss in trust, right? Then there's space or room for populist parties. Voters more or less align with those parties. And then your recommendation more or less is we have not to care about the peanuts, but you know, whatever, to generate whatever income from the big players. Now, just the first thing is, the first question relates to the first stage, so loss of trust. Isn't it possible that this loss of trust at least interacts with how the elites or how the political system responds to economic crisis and shocks? So whatever, take, you said the straitjacket of the Eurozone. So if I have whatever very technical means only, so where it suggests a little bit that, you know, the elites take care of the banks, yeah, but not of my concerns. And when I have a political system like the EU, which more or less has a very weak electoral connection, then it's no surprise, right, that we observe, first at the EU level, perhaps, this Eurosceptic rise of parties, right, and then at the national level. Mm-hmm. So isn't it a little bit, you know, the question how responsive the political system is to such crisis? And as we could see also in the US, as you mentioned, it was one reason which was spelled out was that the political system, and also symbolically Clinton as a representative of this system, was not responsive to the concerns of the people, right? Mm-hmm. And it was more or less a gridlocked system for the elites. So shouldn't we care more about how this system operates and how democratic and responsive it is? That's my first question. Mm-hmm. And the second is, now if I go now to your prediction, there is perhaps an alternative scenario. Now think about that the populist parties do not get the big players to pay their bills. Wouldn't it be that then the voters are disappointed again from their policies? And wouldn't we then predict just a higher turnout instead of a lower turnout, sorry. So they don't, you know, they're disappointed again, they don't go to the vote, et cetera, and then the populist parties might disappear. I mean, it's a very, let's say, optimistic perspective, but as you said, turnout is important when we analyze populism and supportive parties.
Yeah. So first of all, yeah, thanks. The political system responsiveness does matter. It matters in absolute terms everywhere. In relative terms, I'm not so sure that I would say that the effect, the effect, for example, is greater always in a place where, for example, there is less electoral representation, like at the European level. Because if we think about it, the case in which the populists indeed took office is the US, where instead this problem doesn't appear, and it happened in individual countries where again the electoral representation is obviously and the sovereignty, etc., are obviously higher than at the European level. So in relative terms, I'm not sure if that is the variable I would put my finger on. Of course, like there are other institutional characteristics that seem to be quite relevant also empirically. Checks and balances, for example. It's you know, if you think about a rough description that you give to your students in political economy 101 of what democracy means, it's not just elections, it's also checks and balances. And like with what type of separation of powers and blah, blah, blah. And so those things seem to matter because on the one hand, if a populist takes office with a pro-people, anti-elite campaign, then would like to have no restrictions to because like, you know, the Far Start movement in Italy would have liked to do a big citizenship income in order to appease all the southern voters in Italy, etc., without constraints. And they hate the constraints. They hate the European constraints. They hate the whatever. They hate constraints. So in principle, what they want to do is replace those who are objecting in the institution. So in fact, there is a dynamic problem there, right? Because on the one hand, you see that the entry is easier where there are no checks and balances, or there are little checks and balances. But on the other hand, if you don't have checks and balances, then the second point of Thomas kicks in. Because if you don't have checks and balances, then if the policies are wrong, you're going to bump into the wall faster, and the blame is going to be once again to those who failed with policy choices, and there is going to be at some point the quote-unquote optimistic view that after paying the price for those wrong policies, we'll get rid of those who were strategically pandering and producing those wrong policies. But that's only one scenario. There is also the opposite dynamics, which is the US, where the checks and balances are high. It's difficult to bypass the bureaucracy. Many of the policies on the domestic agenda of Trump have not gone through because there are checks and balances indeed. And so in those contexts, on the one hand, he's making perhaps domestically less damages than he would without those checks and balances. But on the other hand, the presence of those checks and balances can prolong the life of a populist because then the blame gets to be shared, right? The blame gets to be shared, and so the bumping into the wall policy, the second question is, so in a sense, your two questions they're really connected, and they relate to what is the dynamics that we can expect.
Okay, thank you very much for this really exciting talk, and thank you for coming, both. So you, of course, Massimo, but also the audience. I think we have listened to a wonderful and really comprehensive analysis of populism and the reasons and consequences of it. And I think this will be a topic, at least in May, at the end of May, we will discuss again. So we have your predictions, and we have one next step, you know, how to check those.
Yeah. And I'm organizing a workshop on populism in Bocconi, April 4 and 5. If those of you who want to participate and get in touch, I'll give you the details.
Okay, thank
Thanks.
you very much. Yeah.